Bahama Wolves.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com. And you can find me as always on Twitter at redrock_Beeble. Today we're going to be looking at the Minnesota Timberwolves in our season preview podcast series. Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. Just again, before we get into that though, a quick reminder, new Patreon tier available, the Good Bloke tier over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/redrock_Beeble. If you do become a member of the Good Bloke tier on Patreon, you get access to our Slack channel, priority invites to Dynasty Leagues, to Red Rock Challenge Leagues, early rookie projections over there for your Dynasty rookie drafts as well. And then you get 2 monthly Patreon-only shows answering mailbag questions, plus 2 shows during the week, during the regular season, live pre-game, pre-tip shows, DFS lineup, streaming option, injury news, all that sort of stuff. So check it out, patreon.com/redrock_Beeble. To help preview the Minnesota Timberwolves for this upcoming season, I'm joined by the new host of the Locked On Timberwolves podcast, Ben Beecken, is here to join me for the first time. Ben, first of all, welcome to the Locked On Podcast Network and welcome to Locked On Fantasy Basketball.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it.
It's good to have you here for this Minnesota Timberwolves team who, there are some changes obviously with this squad. Nothing major. The big change came last season, the firing of Tom Thibodeau, the trade of Jimmy Butler. But we now have a full season of Ryan Saunders. We have a new GM in place, Gerson Rosas is there. He's made some moves over the offseason. But let's start where I have started all of these shows, Ben, by giving a quick injury update. And someone who didn't finish last season with a relatively confusing injury was Robert Covington. What's Covington's injury status like at the moment? Is there any restrictions heading into training camp?
Yeah, the most recent news on him was that they're expecting, I think the quote from one of the beat writers was that they're expecting him to be ready to be a full go in training camp, which seems a little vague considering that's only like 3 weeks away. The injury last year was initially reported as I think it was a bone bruise in his knee. And then weirdly, he sat out. It happened New Year's Eve, actually, December 31st, and then he sat out the rest of the season, had some kind of surgery early in the offseason, but they are expecting him to be back. He's been working out. He worked out with the Summer League team. Obviously didn't play in Summer League, but was at the practices and has been working out with the team this summer. So it's a little worrisome, I guess, that they're not saying he's for sure a full go, but at this point, they're saying that he will be participating in training camp.
He only played 35 games last season, 34 minutes a game, some of that for Philadelphia, some of that for Minnesota, and he just does what he always does. He hit a lot of threes, he got a lot of steals, over 2 per game, blocks a lot of shots, 1.3 blocks, and does it efficiently from 3. His 2-point shooting overall, his overall field goal percentage isn't great, 43%, but we all know who Robert Covington is, the 25th ranked player per game in fantasy last year, 45 the year before that, 40 the year before that. I expect pretty much more of the same. The thing I think could be different this season for Covington, Ben, is I think the Timberwolves are going to ask him to play a lot more power forward. I believe he'll be their starting power forward. Is that how you see the lineup shaking out?
I think that's likely. I think it was in June, shortly after the draft, that Gerson Rosas, who you referenced, the new president of basketball ops with the Timberwolves, mentioned, I think mostly unsolicited, at a press conference that Covington has played some of his best minutes as a pro at the 4, at power forward. And so that kind of led everybody to assume that he may just be starting at power forward this year. I tend to think it could be matchup based. We really don't know. This is just my guess, because they did go out and they signed Noah Vonleh, who I'm sure we'll talk about here in a minute. They have Jordan Bell, and it sounds like they want him to play some 4 and not just strictly play behind Karl-Anthony Towns. So it could be matchup based, especially if they're worried at all about Covington's knee, which again, I don't really have evidence to suggest that they do. But I think there's a possibility that they could, change the starting lineup up a little bit based on matchups. But all that said, I think he certainly will play more minutes at the 4 than he did last season when he was almost exclusively a small forward.
when he played for Philadelphia before Ben Simmons arrived, he averaged 6.5 rebounds per game. If he is playing at the 4, I think we'll see that rebound number go up. It can help his block numbers as well, and it could help his field goal percentage. Covington is always historically underranked on ESPN. They got him at 104, which is nonsense. He's a 3rd or 4th round guy. Yahoo's got him at 36. That's fine. Fantrax at 60 is still pretty low. But what the concern is with Covington is his value is so tied into really one category, and that's the steals. And if that falls off at all, there can be a big fluctuation in his overall value. He still hits threes, he still will block shots, he still grab rebounds. But if the steals go from 2 a game to 1.5, that could be a 15, 20 spot drop in ranking. So he is quite dependent on that one category. It's by far his strongest fantasy category. But and missed a lot of games last season. The year before, he played 80 games. So I don't think we're going out there and labeling him injury prone or anything along those lines. Let's talk about the main guy on this team, though, Ben. It is, of course, Karl-Anthony Towns, who I think people will be a little bit surprised to see only played 33 minutes a night, of course, because the insanity of Tom Thibodeau had ended early in the year. Only 32.5 minutes under Ryan Saunders, but we did see a change in the way that the Timberwolves used him, a change for the positive, because Thibodeau, and I railed on him continuously on this podcast. It's unfortunate that the coaches that I used to go against, Thibodeau and Kidd, aren't in head coaching spots at this point, but he used to misuse him. He didn't get the ball, but we saw over the final 35 games of the season, 27 and 12.5 for Towns. He got 4 assists per game. He was used more in a creating role. I think we're going to see way more of that this season. I think we're going to see probably pretty comfortably his best season as a pro.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, early on last season, he started out slow, and that, of course, was when Tom Thibodeau was still the head coach. But then his second half, or really I guess the last third of the season, was so strong. He was arguably the best player in the NBA, at least on the offensive end of the floor in the month of March. It's fair to assume that that's going to continue. And he did improve on the defensive end of the floor, which isn't a huge deal for fantasy, but obviously that it will help keep him on the floor for more minutes. So I agree. We don't really know what the Timberwolves' new offense will look like, and that's challenging as you prepare for fantasy drafts. But we do know that Gerson Rosas was in the Rockets front office for 17 or 19 years, and there certainly could be a lot of influence there. The Summer League team, I saw some numbers floating around. They basically didn't shoot any mid-range jump shots, which if you've watched any Timberwolves basketball really ever, they've always shot a lot of mid-range jump shots, even in the modern era. And so that just means that Towns, he went from shooting 3.5 threes a game 2 years ago in his first All-Star season to 4.6 threes a game last season. And Saunders is only the head coach for a little more than half the season. So I think it's very likely he's going to be shooting well over 5 threes a game, 5.5 threes a game. And over the last 2 seasons, he shot him at about a 41% clip. So I think that especially is going to continue to grow. And I also agree that he'll be in more of a playmaking role and probably have the ball in his hands a lot more early in the offense.
He, over the last 22 games of last season, Towns, he was the 4th ranked player in fantasy basketball, averaging 28 and 13 on 54 and 81. I don't see really why he can't do that over the course of a season and 4 assists and a steal and hit 2 triples a game. I just don't see why he can't do that. If you wanted to take Karl-Anthony Towns at number 1 in a fantasy draft, I have no problem with that. He's ranked 4th on ESPN, 5th on Yahoo. He's in that group of 5 who I think are pretty interchangeable at number 1: Harden, Curry, Davis, Towns, and Antetokounmpo. And if you want to take Towns, who I'm writing an article at the moment, which is going to probably be out by the time you listen to this podcast, looking at the downside of every player. And I got to Towns and I went, I don't see what can go wrong here, unless there's a weird injury. Maybe that's what it is, because he's never had any sort of injury before. But he feels just rock solid, safe, super efficient, and I think he's going to have the best season of his career this coming year. Now, you brought it up, you talked about mid-range shots, so let's talk about Andrew Wiggins. Is there any hope for Andrew Wiggins, really? Because he struggled so much when Jimmy Butler came across. His efficiency has fallen off completely. He was a 20-point-per-game scorer prior to Butler being there, and he'd had 2 consecutive top 100 fantasy seasons before that, but even last year, once Butler went, the efficiency didn't return, the usage didn't jump back up to where it was before. Yeah, what are we looking at with Wiggins here? Is this just who he is now 5 years in?
I mean, unfortunately, my personal opinion is yes. I think that the ship has kind of sailed on Andrew Wiggins, which is crazy because he's entering his age 24 season. But, I mean, he's essentially been the same player the last 2 seasons, and that's a much worse version of himself than he was the 2 seasons before that. we're currently right now kind of in the middle of the spin cycle with the local media, especially in the Twin Cities. Everybody talking about how Gerson Rosas could have traded Wiggins this offseason, and even before Rosas, the Scott Layden-led front office could have traded him at the deadline in February, but they keep resisting it, and they wouldn't just be salary dumps. They could have actually gotten value back. And so right now, all the articles that are being written are, Rosas thinks they can turn Wiggins around. They think if they can get him to understand what an efficient shot is and what an efficient shot isn't, then he could be a valuable and useful offensive player. And while I think that that's theoretically true, that's a really big challenge. I think the most concerning thing for me is if you dig into his numbers, and I wrote about this and have talked about it on Locked On Wolves, is Wiggins' shots at the rim have gone down drastically, and he's not drawing as many fouls. When he does get to the line over the last 2 seasons, he's shooting only like 67% over the last 2 seasons. So he's just not trying to go to the rim as often. And he's admitted as much when he's been asked in the media, and that started when Jimmy Butler came. And so he's still kind of in this second banana mindset, and he's going to need to shake that. Even though Towns is option A, Wiggins is going to need to understand that he's option B, and that's not a bad thing. The team needs an option B. So I think that it bears close watching early in the season, because there's always a chance that him and Ryan Saunders are good friends. He was in Ryan Saunders' wedding a few years ago. I mean they go back several years, so there's a chance there's somewhat of a resurgence early in the season. But I think if we don't see it pretty quickly, I'm not holding my breath in terms of Wiggins finding some sort of efficiency.
Wiggins has been dropped way down on Yahoo's ranks, 191. I think that's total. Look, it's not fine because he's not that bad of a player. I've got no problem with taking him as a second last pick and hoping that that the scoring or the efficiency bounces back up. He used to be a pretty good free throw shooter. The field goal percentage dropped way off last year. I think if those two things come back up, maybe he is the 110th best player. So I think he's fine taking a stab out there. ESPN at 126. I think that's about the right spot. But the assists, the steals, the blocks, the rebounds, I just don't think they're ever going to come. It's all just going to be about whether he can hit those shots at a rate, which he did a couple of years ago. But again, it seems like his confidence has been almost irreversibly impacted. But we'll have to see whether that can change this season.
Yeah, if I could jump in real quick, I guess one other thing to watch would be, so the rebounds have always been he doesn't rebound the ball, but he's improved that number by almost a half rebound per game each of the last 4 seasons. And if you look at his numbers since Ryan Saunders became head coach, his rebounding numbers especially are way up from when Saunders became head coach in mid-January. And as we know, rebounding, there's a huge chunk of rebounding that is hustle, it's hard, it's want to, in addition to knowing where you need to be on the floor and athleticism. And he's got about 1.5 of those 3 characteristics. And it seems like Saunders got him to play harder the second part of the year. And if that carries over to the season, I think that rebounding number could keep growing. It's just a matter of whether or not he understands the shot selection piece of things. But the encouraging thing about Wiggins once Saunders took over was that he did seem to have more of a want to when it came to rebounding the ball.
Yeah, he got up to 5.6 rebounds per 36 over the final 35 games. Yeah, 2 years ago he was at 3.6 per 36, so it is a pretty significant change there in Wiggins' rebounding. Now, Jeff Teague missed the end of last season with injuries of his own. He did opt in to his player option. He'll be an unrestricted free agent after this season. Given the fact that Tyus Jones has gone, Derrick Rose has gone, I look at Jeff Teague, he wasn't great last year, still a 93rd ranked player in 30 minutes a game. I really don't see much changing here. There's no point guard of the future behind him unless they're going to turn Jarrett Culver into a full-time point guard, which they will play him a point guard. I just don't think they're going to turn him into a full-timer. So I just think Teague is just set for another one of those Jeff Teague seasons where he's the 90th best player in fantasy and he averages 13 and 7. Unless, is there something you can see changing with Teague this season, or is it just, again, another year of more of the same?
I think you're probably right. There were a couple of weird things about his year last year. It was his, he was hurt, so he played only, roughly half the games, and that had never been an issue for him previously. He averaged, by far, it was his lowest usage rate season since early in his career, his first year or two. He averaged less than 10 shots a game. But it was also, he had a career high in assists per game, over 8 assists per game for the first time in his career. But he just was hesitant to shoot the ball. He had his worst 3-point shooting percentage in 5 seasons. There were multiple games where he just wouldn't pull the trigger on open threes, and teams were defending him as if Ricky Rubio is still the Timberwolves point guard. They were going way under screens, daring him to shoot the ball. And I can only think of 1, maybe 2 games where he actually took teams up on that and made some threes. But it was just kind of a weird season for him. And there was a lot of Jeff Teague fatigue in the Twin Cities. It is important to note, like you said, he's an unrestricted free agent next summer. So maybe, and there's not much behind him. It's Shabazz Napier, and then, as you mentioned, Jarrett Culver. There isn't really a third-string point guard on the roster. So provided Teague can stay healthy, and all of his injuries last year were kind of fluky, there was nothing super, nothing really major. You could see, I think, a little bit of a bounce back from him, hopefully a little bit more scoring. They're going to need him to score a little bit more in a contract year. So I think you're probably right. It's not going to be crazy different one way or the other, but we might see a little bit of a bump.
You see him fall in a few mock drafts I've been doing. He falls at 110, 115 range. And I'd snap him up every day of the week. I think there's a lot of value in getting Teague at that position. But if you're talking about long-term dynasty stuff, he's 31 years of age, unrestricted free agent. I get the feeling this is the last season that Jeff Teague is a starting point guard in the NBA. We've seen plenty of guys like last season who were solid starters, like Thad Young, like JJ Redick, who are probably going to be in bench roles this season. I think that same sort of future is going to befall Jeff Teague after this year. But for this year, I think this is that last opportunity to be a top 100 player. Now, the other spot in the starting lineup, to me, it's up for grabs. We're going to have Teague, we're going to have Wiggins, we're going to have Covington, we're going to have Towns. Now, I've seen a few different ways of people could go here, a few different mentions of how they think it could go. One of the ones that I don't think is going to happen is Jake Layman pushing Andrew Wiggins back to the 2. I think it's going to be Josh Okogie, who's the starting shooting guard next to Wiggins. I've also heard people say, they traded up to get Culver, they're going to throw him in there straight away. How do you see it, Ben? Who do you think is that other starter, whether it's shooting guard or small forward?
I think you're right. I think it probably is Okogie. I mentioned earlier the chance or the possibility that Covington plays some 3 and Vonleh starts at the 4. I think that's still possible. But of the guys you mentioned, I don't think it'll be Jarrett Culver. I do think that he'll be one of the first guys off the bench. They'll play him he'll play a little bit of point guard. He'll run some offense as he gets comfortable. But I do think they're just going to go with, the second-year guy in Okogie in the starting role. I think Jake Layman probably comes off the bench. There's always a chance, though, that they choose to have Okogie come off the bench in kind of an energy type role, because that's really his best characteristic at this point. But I think opening that lineup, I think it is Okogie at the 2, Wiggins at the 3, and Covington at the 4, with just a little bit of shifting based on matchups.
Last season, over the final 27 games, he played 26 minutes a night and 171st ranked fantasy player. Much like Covington, his value really came from steals, where he averaged 1.6 steals there. The shooting was horrible, 28% from 3 overall, but he did improve it over the back end of the year, 33% from 3 over those final 27 games. So I think there is some hope that maybe that improves. His summer league would say that I'm lying, but he also shot 30% from 2 in summer league, not a number that's going to stay that low. I think he's worth having a look at as that back-end draft target. I'm not massively high on him, but he does have that ability to provide steals. And I think there is a little bit more in him than what we've seen offensively, but he is going to have to hold off Jarrett Culver at this point. I think they can both play upper 20s in minutes this season, just given the lack of backcourt depth there in Minnesota, and perhaps there is another injury that Teague's ankle still has problems. But I think Okogie's worthwhile looking at as a late round pick, especially if your team is lacking in steals. Let's move on to the rookie though now, Jarrett Culver, who we didn't get to see in summer league because he was too tired. I only half jest at that, but the reasoning wasn't something I was all that impressed with the Timberwolves, that they wanted to get him more in tune with the team before he played. I thought that's exactly what summer league was for. But enough of that. Enough of me talking about their decision not to play Culver. I just wanted to see him. How do we look at what Jarrett Culver is going to do? Again, I seem to be a lot more down on him than other people. People think, no, he's straight away, he's playing 30 a night, he's going to have they're going to give him the keys. I don't see it for him. I think the shot is a concern. Rookie point guards, especially ones who aren't full-time point guards, they might struggle if they're forced into that role. What are you expecting from Culver for this season?
Yeah, I don't know that I would expect much in terms of offensive production. I think what you said is probably pretty close to correct. I think he's in the rotation from day one, but I think he's kind of a bit player early on, 10, 12 minutes a game as they kind of ease him in. And depending on how that goes, he could very well end up getting some minutes at point guard, playing both wing spots, moving forward. But you're right. I mean, you look at his college career, his shooting numbers from deep, it dipped to 30% last season, and obviously he was in a much more high usage role. He was running the offense. He was the top scorer on the team, and so there was a lot of pressure on him at Texas Tech. But I don't know that he's a plug and play starter at this point, even for a team that's not likely to make the playoffs. That said, I think this is the type of scenario where, you're looking at a solid rookie year followed by, I think by year 2 he could be a starter. Clearly they think highly of him to trade up and to select him at number 6. I just don't know that there's going to be much early on, to even really take a flyer on him in a draft.
He's worth at least looking at because of his ability to get assists, to get rebounds, and get steals, and that can all be useful. If he's playing 27 a night, coming off the bench, point guard, at the 2, at the 3 even, there is some value there. But the percentages, bad free throw shooter, not an efficient field goal guy, not an efficient three-point shooter. There are definite concerns there with Culver, and I'm not sure how that role is going to go. I think the idea from the Timberwolves is eventually you're going to have Okogie and Culver both start, and they would like to get off Wiggins at some point, depending, I guess, of course, on what happens this season. I've posed this question to people before. I don't remember where I did it, but people said, no, Culver's definitely going to start because he was the 6th pick and he's going to start over Okogie. And I said, well, if Culver was in Okogie's draft, I'm not actually sure which one of those guys actually would have been drafted first, given the relative strengths of these overall drafts. So that is...
Sure.
Look, there's 6 months difference in terms of age between these guys, so it's not a huge difference there. It's not like one's 23 and one's 19 or anything like that. So we are still looking at them. And again, if Culver was in that draft, I think he would have been in that 19, 20, 17 range, sort of where Okogie was anyway. So I think we should be looking at them maybe as similar prospects. The fact that Culver came out this year boosts his overall perception by being the 6th pick in a draft that is considerably weaker than a really, really strong one that we had the year before. But there is some value now. ESPN's got him ranked at 85. You'd be absolutely crazy to draft Culver at 85. That's like the one percentile chance, 99 percentile outcome for him this season to be at that level. I just cannot see it. Long term, I'm not massively high on him, but again, the shooting's got to come around. That's really what it all is going to come down to for Jarrett Culver. Now, this is a fantasy basketball show, Ben, so I do have to give a quick shout out to Gorgie Jeng, who used to be a fantasy stud. Is he going to play at all this year?
That's a great question. I don't know. I really don't think he's going to be in the rotation.
I don't either.
Yeah, I mean, they signed Noah Vonleh, they signed Jordan Bell. They have, obviously, Karl-Anthony Towns. We already talked about Covington playing the 4. Jake Layman played some 4 last year in Portland, and to get him on the floor, he might be playing some 4. I just don't see Gorgie Jeng playing very much unless they're playing, the rare team that has, a couple of big guys who are seeing minutes, or if there's Towns has massive foul trouble or something. I mean, because Jordan Bell might see some minutes at the 4, but he's also your backup 5. So, I'm sure that the Timberwolves are open and willing to trade in Gorgie Jeng as soon as they have the opportunity. He's still got 2 years left on his deal, so he's not exactly an attractive trade chip at this point in time. But yeah, he is the sort of guy where if he gets regular minutes, he's going to produce. It's just the last couple seasons he didn't get regular minutes and he never quite found his groove.
He's also 29, going to turn 30 during this season as well. So I just don't see him as a regular part of the rotation. But a guy who will be is Jordan Bell. You referenced him already being the backup 5, playing some minutes at the 4. Do you think that Bell or Vonleh will play more minutes this season?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I'm going to say Bell because he can play both the 4 and the 5. I think that there's a little bit more upside there. I think that I know he played mostly the 5, but handled the ball a decent amount in Golden State. There's been a couple interviews with him where he's talked about how one of the reasons he came to Minnesota was the opportunity to play with Towns and not just behind him, and that he wants the opportunity to play make a little bit more instead of just swinging the ball around the perimeter like he did with the Warriors. And clearly he knows that he's going to have that opportunity in Minnesota. So I think it'll be Bell, and I'm really intrigued to find out how the Wolves use him this year, and if it is more of a backup behind Towns, occasionally play the 4 type role, or if they're going to try and maybe feature him a little bit off the bench with a second unit that really doesn't have a lot of guys that are going to go out there and score on their own. And so I think there's a shot that Bell sees some solid minutes off the bench as the backup 4.
Now, we know Bell had issues with Golden State. Kerr refused to use him. There was a lot of clashes with him. He got suspended during the season as well for, I don't remember which coach it was, but for sending fake room service bills up to a certain coach. I wish I could remember who it was. Mike Woodson, maybe? I don't remember who it was exactly.
I think so, yeah.
Who he was doing it to. But as a rookie, on a per 36-minute basis, if we look at every player in the NBA who played a minimum of 10 minutes a game, and put them all per 36 minutes, Jordan Bell was the 16th best fantasy player. he averaged 12 and 9 with 4.5 assists, 1.6 steals, and 2.5 blocks. They are insane numbers. 63 from the field, 68 from the line. Now, unfortunately, nearly everything fell. His scoring, his rebounds, his assist rate cut dramatically. His steal rate cut in half. The only thing that didn't fall by much was his block rate. Field goal percentage dropped down by almost 11 percentage points. His free throws were down by 7 percentage points. Just huge drop-offs. And I think we have to attribute so much to that. It's not him forgetting how to play, but being distracted by the clashes with the coaching staff. I think there's a real bounce-back opportunity. Now, there's not 30 minutes in him, but if he finds a 22, 23-minute-a-night role, he's someone to watch, because those defensive numbers paired with efficiency, playmaking as well, and we know the Wolves know how to use a big man in a playmaking role. Saunders is going to be looking to that, and Bell can do it. He's a really interesting guy in those deeper leagues who is ranked at 332 on ESPN, which is really, really low. I think he's in that 200 sort of range, who could push up depending on how things go. I think it's an interesting situation for him to get his career back on track. As for Vonleh, started for the Knicks last season, played 25 minutes a game, but that did reduce to 23 minutes a night over the last half of the season. He put up some pretty big numbers in terms of efficiency, stuff that he hadn't done before, improved his free throw percentage up by almost 10 percentage points, shot the three ball pretty well, but he did drop off as the season went on, and even if he does start, as you mentioned, is a possibility, I don't see him playing conventional starter minutes, do you?
No, I think if he starts, it is more of a, hey, he's our most, the closest thing to just a traditional is not even the right word, but a run-of-the-mill starting power forward, and he can slide in and play 20 minutes a game. But he's certainly not. It's more of a supporting role. I think if you look at the last half of 2 seasons ago, I think when he was traded to Chicago, and then last year with the Knicks, he started shooting way more threes than he ever had in his career, and he's hit them at about league average. And so I think that was referenced in his introductory press conference that he's going to keep shooting the three and keep improving there. So I think if he does show some improvement from beyond the arc, being a bigger body with the ability to hit from three, which is something that they don't. Robert Covington isn't that big of a body at the four, and Jordan Bell can't hit from three. So Vonleh does have that mix of the ability to hit 3-pointers and guard bigger guys. So again, I think that they will be very matchup dependent there. But anything more than like 20 minutes a game, even as a starter, would surprise me from Vonleh.
You'll be well aware of this, but Vonleh had the old Derrick Rose diet in terms of 3-point shooting last year. 34% shooting over the course of the season, 18% over the final 26 games of the year. So it did drop off pretty consistently. He was red hot to start the season, and it was one of those things where he was just shooting at a level he'd never had before, and then it fell off to a pretty disappointing level, 18% on 2 attempts per game over his final 26 games. So that's something to look at there. We talked about a little bit earlier Shabazz Napier as the backup point guard. Napier, when he's always given an opportunity, whether it was Portland or Brooklyn, if he's forced into larger minutes, he produces. So that's really what we're looking at him here for. But just circling back to Culver a bit, do you think that it's gonna limit what Napier's doing, because they are going to want to, or how committed are they to getting Culver as a point guard on this team?
I'm not really sure, actually. The Timberwolves haven't really tipped their hand much to that, other than just acknowledging that, hey, he ran the offense for the most part at Texas Tech. So I think, and this is just kind of my hunch, is that early in the season, you've got Teague and Napier, 2 veterans who know what they're doing, and Napier's a solid backup. I think those guys are going to play the lion's share of the minutes at the 1. And then I think there is going to be some thought to putting Culver in a position to run the offense. And maybe it's as a point forward more than strictly, the ball handler on the floor. Maybe it's Napier's on the floor also, but Culver's initiating. I think they might get to that point in January if they're 10 games out of the playoffs or whatever. But I don't think that it'll start that way early. I think Napier's going to see pretty standard backup point guard minutes as he has in his last couple of stops. As a pretty average, maybe above average 3-point shooter and just a decent initiator of offense. I think that he'll just kind of be your standard point guard unless and until Culver shows the ability to run the point at the NBA level.
Jake Layman came across as a restricted free agent / sign and trade. And it's one of those interesting situations. He goes from a better team to a situation where he's probably playing fewer minutes on a worse team, which is a weird one. He played 22 minutes a night over the second half of last season for the Blazers, 19 minutes overall. I struggled just with the guys in front of him, Kogi, Culver, Wiggins, Covington, to see how Layman is pushing to that 21, 22 minute a night mark. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I just struggle to see how he gets to that level. Yeah,
agreed. The Timberwolves went from having a really thin depth chart at the wing spots to just a jam-packed position. And all virtually everybody, everyone except Wiggins, Covington, and Okogie was a new addition. From drafting Culver to signing and trading for Layman, and then we haven't even talked about the guys that are behind them. But yeah, it does feel like Jake Layman's like the fifth guy. He might be like the third option at power forward and like the fifth option on the wing. And there's still some upside. I think he's going to be in his age 25 season. He did show some ability shooting the three, but nothing crazy. It was pretty average. So it's interesting. He seems to be the type of cutter and average 3-point shooter that can slot in on anybody's bench and give you 15 to 20 solid minutes. But I agree with you. I don't know. I have seen some people, some media folks in the Twin Cities suggest that he might land that last starting role, just as kind of you're going to get for the most part, and there is still a little bit of upside. But I think I agree with you. I think it's more likely that he's kind of the fifth wing off the bench, sees some spot minutes at the 4, is somewhere around 15 minutes a game maybe. And if he gets hot and shows that he can shoot the 3 more regularly, perhaps he edges past somebody, whether it's Culver or Okogie in the rotation. But yeah, I don't see him being a major part of the rotation.
If people are looking at Jake Layman thinking, you know what you're going to get, I push back against that, because his first 70 games in the NBA, he shot 29% from the field. His next 70 games, he shot 51%. Like, which one's real? I don't think that someone's gone from a sub 30% shooter over 2 years to a 51% shooter. Hitting his two-pointers at 65%, which is a ridiculously high amount. Yes, 37%, which is where he was at, is a ridiculously low amount. But I think there's a fair regression coming there. He doesn't do too much else. He doesn't pass. He doesn't really get any defensive numbers. He's a poor rebounder. I just don't really see it. For Layman, he's 25 already, 4 years older, 4.5 years older than Okogie, 5 years older than Culver. I just don't see it for a guy that had one season of some really hot shooting, and it was really good, but the 3 didn't even go in that well, 33% from 3 as well. I just don't really see it there for Layman. The last guy I do want to just quickly touch on was a player who was pretty successful at a college level, Keita Bates-Diop, who had some interesting moments at the end of last season. Just all these additions, Bell, Vonleh, Layman. Is Rosas out on Bates-Diop as any sort of contributor?
I don't know. I think it's too early to tell, but you're right. I mean, the amount of guys that they added that play some of those same, their wings that can also play the 4. I mean, Bates-Diop suddenly is sliding down the depth chart. He's not ahead of anybody else that we've talked about. He did have some nice moments at the end of last year, like you mentioned. Summer League, the first game or two, he looked like a almost 24-year-old who, should be playing really well in NBA Summer League as a Big Ten Player of the Year, 4-year college player, 1 year in the NBA. But then the second half of Summer League, or the last 5 or 6 games, he really struggled with his shot. He couldn't get to the rim. He couldn't make his open shots. So that was a little bit alarming to me. I think the idea of Bates-Diop is still that he could be an effective NBA player in that he can do a little bit of everything, but he doesn't do anything extremely well. He's a big body. He's not super athletic. He's not a great shooter, but he can rebound. He can pass. There's just nothing that really stands out. So I think he's the sort of guy where if he ever finds significant minutes, whether it's in Minnesota or somewhere else, he's going to contribute in multiple categories, but he's not going to be ultra efficient. And I'm not sure he's going to wow in any one category. So I would not expect him to be in the top 10 of the Timberwolves rotation this year. But if they were to move on from him and he went somewhere else, maybe a worse team where he could find some minutes, there's a little bit of intrigue there just with what he could potentially provide.
All right, that'll wrap it up for looking at this Timberwolves roster. Of course, there's Jalen Noel, Jordan McLaughlin at the back end there, Trevion Graham, Naz Reid. Ty Wallace, who I don't imagine is going to stick on this roster because they do need to cut someone. I think he is going to be the guy to go. But let's give some value and bust guys for drafts. I think Covington at 104 on ESPN is great value. And the fact that ESPN has Covington 20 spots lower than Jarrett Culver should tell you all you need to know about that. Culver at 85 is just way too high. There's just no reason to be picking him at that level. Ben, let everybody know, where they can find you on social media and what you've got going on the Locked On Timberwolves podcast.
Absolutely. So my Twitter handle is Beecken, Beecken. And I am, as you mentioned, Josh, I'm the new host of Locked On Wolves. We're about to launch into over-unders for the entire league. I'm going to have a couple of guests on with me. We're going to go through each team, spend 5 to 10 minutes on each team, and additions and subtractions and where we think they're going to be based on their Vegas win totals. That's kind of the next thing. And then we're going to go through division previews as well. And then, man, like 3 weeks till media day, then we're off and running.
Go and check out Ben over on Twitter and check out the Locked On Timberwolves podcast. Ben, thanks for jumping on with me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that'll do it for today's show. Check me out on Twitter at redrock_Beeble, Instagram Locked On Fantasy Basketball, and subscribe to this podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and on YouTube. On YouTube, please hit that thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think about the Minnesota Timberwolves. What do you think? Can Karl-Anthony Towns be the number one player in fantasy basketball? Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Jordan Bell.